Hello, it's a delight for me to be here with you today. My name is Sean Ennis. I'm the director of the Center for Competition Policy, and we have Anna Tzanaki, who's here with us from Leeds, and she's going to be talking about the perils and promises of killer acquisitions. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly.
Yeah, that's good.
And we're really delighted to have you with us today, and looking forward to hear your take on killer acquisitions.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Norwich. I had very good impressions so far. So I'll be presenting today my latest paper, which is the full title. It's a long title. Dynamism and Politics in EU Merger Control, the Perils and Promise of a Killer Acquisition Solution through a Law and Economics Lens. Okay, so this is forthcoming in the Antitrust Law Journal. I've been working on this for some time. I'm trying to focus on the European side of the problem of killer acquisitions and show the promise or the problems that I see with the solutions that the EU has come up with to solve this problem, adopting a law and economics lens. Okay. So in a nutshell, if you fall asleep during my presentation and you just remember this slide, you're good to go. Okay, so in a nutshell, there has been a lot of discussion and policy debate around the topic of killer acquisitions, perhaps with a particular problematic issue in EU merger control, because a lot of these transactions fall below the EUMR thresholds, the thresholds of the merger regulation that we have in Europe. So there's been a question in economic and legal cycles whether there is a jurisdictional gap because the Commission cannot review those mergers and what we should do about it. Now, from an economic point of view, when we say killer acquisitions, we really talk about acquisitions of small startup firms, so innovative firms that have no turnover, and this is particularly problematic in the European context where scrutiny depends on turnover thresholds essentially. So I focus in this paper on the system of merger competence allocation we have in the EU, and as I just explained, it is all based on thresholds, at least what we have in the European merger regulation. And this has pros and cons. It was a very clear-cut system, very predictable, and at the same time, excuse my voice. And at the same time, it excludes jurisdictional competition between the Commission and member states. What do I mean by that? I will explain later, but to give you an idea, mergers who fall above the thresholds were only reviewed by the European Commission, and mergers who were below would be reviewed by member states. So I explain in the paper later why this is so important and how the later solutions that we try to find in the EU context, and it's one of those exceptions that I have here in the parentheses, a case referral mechanism, Article 22 in the EUMR, is a little bit problematic if you look at it from a law and economics perspective. So yeah, it was a very simple and predictable system. Now, in 2021, the Commission issued a guidance on Article 22, which was one of the referral mechanisms, an upwards referral mechanism, meaning even for transactions that fell below the thresholds of the EUMR and potentially would fall within the jurisdiction of a member state, that member state could send the case to the Commission to review it, okay? So that is what we call upwards referral. The problem with this, analyzing the political dimension in this context, is that the Commission decided to expand this Article 22 mechanism on its own without going back to the member states and discussing about it. And I'm saying that this was against what was agreed when the EUMR was introduced, okay? So I call this unilateral repurposing of Article 22. Now, my problem with the Article 22 solution of the Commission is that essentially it introduces, uncertainty and discretion in merger control, because both referrals from member states, but also their acceptance or rejection is discretionary. So we have an element of discretionary enforcement now. And also it introduces jurisdictional competition between the EU and member states for below threshold transactions that we didn't have before. Okay, this change in policy. So is there anything good about the solution? I'm suggesting if you look at the issue from a law and economics perspective, there were two problems that the threshold-based system that we had in Europe had. There was a deterrence problem, a deterrence gap, and there was also an externality problem. Not all cross-border cases perhaps would be reviewed at EU level. However, the Article 22 solution of the Commission does not solve these two problems, and as I said, creates other ones, such as discretion. But I'm also suggesting that it's not just a minor tweak in the existing system of competence allocation that we had between the EU and member states, but I see it as a major transformation. Because I'm suggesting that before we had a very clear-cut system of fixed competencies, so what I call a zero-sum game in game theoretic language, and now that was transformed to a non-zero-sum game. So we don't know what is happening for below-threshold transactions now. It's a very unpredictable situation. Okay, so it's not an ideal solution. I'm suggesting at the end of the paper, mentioning some solution. Yes.
So now for the Commission, one challenge is also that they have a difficulty controlling, for example, where to allocate the resources, because before they could foresee, for example, they're going to be referred because there was all the threshold supposed in one country, but now not knowing that, is it possible that they need to maintain certain capacity to be used on the referrals, that they would not be aware at the time, or how does it work within the allocation of the budget of the EU, for example, DGCOM?
It is unpredictable. So I don't think, and one of the mechanisms that I'm suggesting in the end is stronger coordination. So we need a better governance network. There is something that is very informal, but I think all those things need to be much more streamlined and formalized if we are to expand and use the referral mechanism as a mainstream enforcement tool, basically. Because you're right, in theory, if there are too many referrals, then perhaps too many resources will be in the less important cases rather than the ones that,
want to focus on.
Yes. Yeah. But I don't address this directly in the paper. Okay. Great, so trying now to unravel this story and tell you a bit about the details. So the first part of the paper, I do a literature review, basic of the economic literature, and I define the problem of killer acquisitions. In the literature, those are considered acquisitions that try to eliminate or suppress future competition. So it's about innovation here that we're talking about, something happening in the future. However, the challenge for lawyers is that it's very difficult to distinguish ex ante, in the context of ex ante merger control, the harmful killers from the beneficial acquisitions of startups, okay? And a lot of the economic literature also suggests that perhaps the risk is higher in certain sectors than others, okay? For example, in pharmaceuticals, we have more evidence about this. Whereas in the digital or tech sectors, there is a lot of debate. Yes.
I wonder whether even ex post it might be difficult to identify a killer merger.
We had this discussion with your colleague here. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Another body of economic literature, for example, by Thomas Waldman, suggests that a lot of these acquisitions are happening disproportionately below thresholds. So we've seen a lot of digital M&A, and the question until recently has been why there has been no enforcement whatsoever against these mergers. So one question perhaps one could ask is law the problem itself, like the thresholds that we have? Waldman in this paper essentially highlights the problem of strategic behavior. He suggests in his study that, when the thresholds in the US were increased and the likelihood of detection and enforcement was reduced, we could see more anti-competitive M&A happening below thresholds. And also, other literature suggests that we see smaller deals happening or earlier than one would expect, with an understanding that they try to avoid legal scrutiny. Okay. In the EU, this problem could be particularly important because not only we have the merger thresholds, and below those the EU does not have jurisdictions. So unless we have national competence on those cases, we cannot review them. But in the EU, we can also not use antitrust rules until recently to review those transactions. In the US, it's different. So we see a double gap in a way. So I'm suggesting that the problem of under-enforcement until recently was quite significant. So it's not a surprise that the EU tried to find some solution that they could within the constraints that I had. Okay, so now we have this new solution, the Article 22 of the EUMR. So a good thing about it, and there was a consultation whether we should change the EUMR or there are other ways to expand the system. So a lot of respondents suggested that reforming the thresholds, lowering them, or introducing new ones would be again an imprecise mechanism of capturing killer acquisitions. Perhaps again, too many acquisitions will be within the net of ex-ante scrutiny, and that will divert resources to not significant cases. So the good part about Article 22 is that it can be a selective enforcement mechanism. You can choose, in other words, which cases to go after. However, the way the guidance of the Commission was structured, they didn't give us a lot of clue which cases they really want. They had almost unlimited, in my view, jurisdiction on whether and when they can prosecute cases. Then in parallel with Article 22, there is another legal instrument, not within the merger regulation, but within the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, Article 14, that suggests that companies who are designated as gatekeepers should report all their transactions to the European Commission. So this is a way, in other words, to increase detection of those transactions, okay, but not necessarily enforcement, unless member states have powers to look at those cases. So we see things are happening, but they're not so streamlined, in my view. Okay, now the next part of my paper, and I think here is perhaps my most significant contribution, is I focus on the political underpinnings of the EUMR, the merger regulation regime. And I suggest that the thresholds, we don't have them there as a technicality. It's not just an economic measure that we introduced in EU merger control. In fact, they were part of the political bargain between the EU and member states. So what does that mean? Especially for member states who already had national competence in merger control, they were very reluctant to give away part of those powers for the EU to have pan-European merger control. Okay, so there was heated negotiations for many decades. So it is no coincidence that it took us up to 1990 for us to have a merger regulation at the European level in Europe. Okay, so there was a reason why the thresholds in that regulation were very high initially, and why also other conditions, for example, we needed EU turnover for two parties to be captured by the European thresholds and so on. Importantly, there were proposals for a more expansive regime, something that would introduce broader powers to review transactions, such as including a calling power, but that was rejected by the Council. The Council is the member states, essentially. Okay, so the EUMR was part of a broader deal. Not only it served member states because they thought it's better to have an EUMR that only deals with a few very large cross-border transactions, rather than having antitrust rules that could be used to prosecute mergers and acquisitions. And that was a credible threat. At that time, because the Commission did not have a merger regulation, they were trying to use Article 101 and 102 of the TFEU to go against mergers, but also minority acquisitions. Okay. So based on that leverage, eventually the member states agreed. It's also self-industry, so meaning business, because they prefer to have a centralized regime that they will have to file one notification at the EU level, and hoping that they will be more lenient against mergers, rather than having to file, in each and every member state that would be competent. So I'm suggesting that the thresholds, and another way to call transactions that fall above the thresholds is mergers that have an EU dimension, that's how we call them, were an objective jurisdictional criterion that was very consciously introduced in the EUMR. And it was meant exactly to capture very large cross-border mergers. And essentially the thinking here was mergers that would involve at least 3 member states. In fact, there is a proviso in Article 1 where we find the thresholds that suggest if mergers involve predominantly 1 member state, those are excluded from the competence of the European Commission, and they should be reviewed at member state level. From an economic point of view, one way to see this 2/3 rule and the turnover thresholds in general is as a proxy for the relevant geographic market, where one needs to evaluate the facts. So if it's a cross-border case, more or not. At that time, it's interesting because the dynamics really favored the Commission negotiations introducing the EUMR, meaning that cross-border cases of large companies but from different member states would be viewed as a good thing, because markets would be unconcentrated, it would be a way to further integrate the internal market. So merger policy was not viewed as bad, and especially from companies that wanted to further integrate across European borders. Now, I said that the thresholds were very high initially. They haven't changed, although there was a hope by the Commission that they would. However, over time, due to inflation, de facto they were lowered. Okay. Now, the EU merger control system is based on certain principles. 3 of those principles are the principle of one-stop shop, subsidiarity, and legal certainty. Legal certainty is obvious, so I'll focus more on the one-stop shop and subsidiarity aspect. So one-stop shop means what? As I explained earlier, M&A that would be above the thresholds will be exclusively reviewed by the Commission. So if you were fulfilling those conditions, you knew very clearly that you only had to file your case at the European level, so with the Commission. Below the thresholds, merger cases would be subject to national competence, so the laws of member states, if they had any, and that if is important. I will explain later why. And the second principle is the principle of subsidiarity. So there is this rule in the EU that we should act at supranational level only when it's needed. In other words, only when the scale and effects of the action require EU action, okay? And national action will not be enough to address that problem. So in this context, turnover thresholds, as I mentioned earlier, could be seen as a filter for significant spillover effects across member states. And in this case, perhaps the subsidiarity principle would justify intervention at the EU level, because the Commission would be best placed to internalize those externalities in those cases with EU impact. The thresholds had good and bads. So as I mentioned, it was a very clear system. And importantly, they excluded parallel jurisdiction between the EU and member states. The only exception, and it was a small exception, was case referral mechanisms. But very importantly, the way that referrals were used, and it could be both upwards and downwards, so both also from the Commission to member states, they were not supposed to undermine these fundamental principles that I just explained: subsidiarity, one-stop shop, and case referral, and legal certainty. Now, the problem with Article 22 and its expansion is that I explain in my paper, it goes against those principles, and I'll explain later why. So referrals could have good characteristics as well. For example, they would allow flexibility in an otherwise very fixed system based on the thresholds. So one could reallocate cases to the most appropriate authority. However, the referral mechanisms that we have in the EUMR were also the product of political negotiations and compromise, and certain member states wanted their national interest to be safeguarded, so they pushed for those to be adopted. So there is a reason why one of those referral mechanisms, we call them the German clause, and Article 22 that I'm focusing on today, we call it the Dutch clause. It was Netherlands and other smaller member states, such as Italy, that pushed for this. And importantly, however, the downside of referrals is, as I mentioned earlier, they're voluntary, okay? And that perhaps introduces unwanted aspects into an otherwise legal system of merger control. Okay. Now, I will try to focus a little bit on the Article 22 referral mechanism and explain its logic at its inception and how it has evolved over the years and what the Commission tried to do with its later expansion. So originally, Article 22 essentially could be seen as a mechanism furthering subsidiarity, one of the principles I said that support merger control in Europe. So for member states who didn't have merger control at all, such as Netherlands at the time, and because those member states were very concerned that larger member states could only review those transactions and not take into account their national interest, they suggested that it would be a good idea to be able to refer cases to the Commission to look at them on their behalf, okay, for their territory. So essentially, that did not change the jurisdictional allocation that we had based on the thresholds. And importantly, at that time, the implementing regulation, a procedural regulation that we use for the Commission to be able to apply and enforce Article 101 and 102 TFEU, so the antitrust rules, non-merger rules at the EU level, was disapplied. The Commission, in fact, disapplied this regulation to convince member states to agree to the EUMR so that they drop, prosecuting M&A under the antitrust rules. So that means that member states or the Commission would not have another tool to go after M&A that would escape their national merger control. So this was the logic of the original Article 22. Then in 1997, there was an amendment of the EUMR and a second function of Article 22 was introduced regarding joint referrals. So the Commission said, wait, perhaps we can streamline these referral mechanisms in cases we have joint referrals by 2 or more member states. In cases with cross-border effects, importantly, perhaps the EU would be a better place to look at those cases, and we also avoid multiple filings at the EU level, so it makes sense that those cases are referred at the EU level. So that was done. The downside of this was that still the Commission could only review those cases for the territory of the member states who decided, who agreed to give their own jurisdiction in those cases. In 2004, there was another amendment that added a paragraph in Article 22 and suggested that the Commission can invite member states to make a referral, but it was always understood that a referral could be triggered post-notification. So if there was a national filing, after that, the national authority could refer the case to the Commission. It was not pre-notification, only parties with another article that was introduced for paragraph 5, another referral mechanism, the merging parties could refer a case to the Commission. So this is important because we'll see later it was changed. What I'm trying to suggest by highlighting the history of this provision is that Article 22 was never expected or supposed to be a general basis for jurisdiction for below-threshold transactions. In fact, if one looks at the statistics, and these are statistics by the European Commission that I cite here, and in the paper. One sees that up to 21, when this policy change was done and Article 22 was expanded, these types of case referrals were quite rare. There were 50, total 51. And in the few years since 2021, there were 10. And there would be much more if we didn't have this judgment by the European Court of Justice that I'll explain later last year that put a stop to that trend. Okay, so I'm trying to put now Article 22 in context of other solutions that were complementary and introduced by the European Commission. So the initial guidance of the Commission repurposed Article 22 to selectively catch potentially any below threshold merger, because they thought it's a targeted tool that fits more digital and dynamic markets, so we don't know exactly which deals we need to target. The important thing is that they introduced this mechanism not only to allow referrals for member states that had competence, but also for member states that had merger control rules in place, but transactions would fall below their own national thresholds. And this was the problematic and, very debatable part of this new policy. The first case where this new policy was tested was the EUMR grade involving two US companies where the target had no activities in the US, and according to the national laws of all member states, they didn't have to file a deal anywhere in Europe, in any member state. Nonetheless, the Commission asserted jurisdiction based on referral from non-competent member states, okay, who had rules in place, but they were not competent to look at the deal. In parallel, I already explained that we have now an Article 14 in the DMA, and it's interesting to see how that dovetails or complements the Article 22 policy. This involves only gatekeepers, so only certain digital companies who must report their transactions to the Commission. Importantly, this is only a transparency regime, so the Commission cannot do anything. They can just, do all the notifications that they receive from those gatekeepers, but they have no enforcement powers whatsoever. However, if one looks at the further provisions of Article 14, they say we need to provide a list of those acquisitions to member states, okay? So they can look at them. And the next provision says, and member states then they can refer those cases back to us through Article 22. So they found a way to close the enforcement gap, let's say, in the EUMR without amending, legally speaking, the EUMR, okay? And that, I think, is also problematic. Now, another interesting thing happened, another important judgment from the European Court, the Tarocas case, that now made clear that national authorities, meaning both competition authorities and courts, can use antitrust rules, and specifically Article 102, so abuse of dominance law, to go after below threshold mergers if they were not reviewed ex ante. So there is another last resort tool of ex post enforcement in this case. And this was not clear until this judgment, which is also quite recent. However, in a very important judgment, again from the European Court of Justice, in EUMR Grail, so the first case that was where this new policy was enforced, they decided that actually the Commission cannot accept referrals from member states that did not have a EU dimension, meaning they were below the EUMR thresholds, below the thresholds of the EU merger regulation, from non-competent national competition authorities, okay? From authorities that had national merger control, but they were below their own provisions, okay? After that, the Commission and member states tried to reposition, said, oh yeah, great. Well, this judgment, they said, didn't affect us much because we can still pursue traditional, what they call Article 22 referrals, meaning from competent member states that would not have, filing only obligations, but perhaps ex post calling powers, okay? They would have a mechanism to call in transactions if they wanted to. And now we see a tendency of member states more and more of them expanding the national merger control regimes and introducing calling powers. So based on that, presumably they can refer the case to the Commission. And there is a pending case before the European Court by NVIDIA that we will see if they restrict more the ability of the Commission to accept referrals based on national calling powers. It is also debatable if in the future there will be amendment so as to allow no jurisdiction referrals of cases where member states don't have jurisdiction anyway, which is what was at issue in the EUMR case. Okay, so what has happened now with these changes? I think one can focus on this table and perhaps, we should show here. Above the thresholds, everything is as it used to be. So the Commission is only competent only on the basis of the EUMR. But below the thresholds, only member states used to have competence based on their national merger control, either ex post or ex ante. But now we see with the introduction of Article 22, the Commission can suddenly gain jurisdiction in cases we don't know ex ante when. And now with Article 102 TFEU also in play, either member states or perhaps the Commission, but it's debatable for legal reasons why they cannot do it, because this procedural regulation implementing them is not applicable. So we see a more dynamic picture essentially for below threshold transactions, and jurisdiction is not clear. This raises a question also about the relationship between Article 22 in the EUMR and antitrust law, in this case Article 102 TFEU. And I'm suggesting here, the bottom line, I think, from this slide is their relationship is not clear. There's no clear hierarchy or, legal principles, limiting principles suggesting when. We could make some rationalization out of this, and I tried to do that in paper, but it's theoretical. And so far, we don't know as a matter of policy or as a matter of law what is happening, what is the relationship between the two provisions. Okay. So in the next part of the paper, I'm trying to take a step back and understand why all this is happening. Why suddenly Article 22 and killer acquisitions are everywhere and so heavily debated at the European level. I'm suggesting this is part of a change in political economy, and the Commission sees killer acquisitions as a threat to the internal market. In the latest political guidelines of the President of the European Commission and the Draghi report, we see a lot of talk about European competitiveness, innovation, and in that context, killer acquisitions, especially of European startups by foreign companies, is very often brought up. So it's linked to these broader objectives, okay? And the Commission here has two fears, I think. One fear is fragmentation, that member states will go and regulate the gap that exists at EU level regarding below threshold transactions. So there will be a patchwork of solutions. And then they're also worried that perhaps they will lose the global race for technological leadership, which is a much more important concern. So by introducing this Article 22 solution, I'm suggesting they didn't only try to fill technical gaps, so address situations where we could have competition harm. In theory, member states could introduce solutions doing that, but they also want to make sure that we have European jurisdiction over those cases, okay? They thought, in other words, that they were important and the EU should have a say over that. So the repurposing of Article 22 could be seen as a way to maximize the effectiveness of EU merger control. So based on Article 22, any case below the thresholds now could potentially be brought and looked at the European level. However, the way that this provision was repurposed and expanded, too much in my view, overexpanded EU jurisdiction via the back door. Okay, and what do I mean by that? The threshold-based system that we had was, without explicitly saying so, was revised de facto, and from a very fixed competence allocation rule, we moved to a very case-by-case situation where we don't know ex ante when it will be triggered. And Article 22, in other words, was transformed from an exceptional mechanism to a potential catch-all tool, okay? So we saw that a calling power was rejected when the EUMR was introduced, but now it's brought back in an indirect way. And this is what I mean by via the back door. So now what happened with this presumption that EU dimension mergers are those who entail significant cross-border effects? I suggest that this presumption was changed as the function of Article 22 changed over the year. So this presumption could be seen as conclusive when Article 22 was introduced, because only national cases where member states did not have competence could be referred to the Commission, or delegated, as we say. Then in 1997, when Article 22 was expanded, that presumption became rebuttable, but within clear limits. I mean, here there were clear conditions when a case could be reallocated from member states who had competence, to the European Commission. And it only involved member states that had competence and where filing was required in at least 3 member states. So there were very clear criteria, in other words, when those cases would be triggered. Now, with the latest expansion, this presumption is again rebuttable, but without limiting principles. And that means that jurisdiction could be created based on referral from member states that did not have jurisdiction. They could make the Commission to have jurisdiction that also didn't have. So it's a bit of an odd situation. Okay, another, I think, important takeaway from my paper is that, we moved from a system of EU merger competence allocation that was based on mutually exclusive competencies, so what I call a zero-sum game. So above the thresholds, only the Commission existed, below member states, now to a very complex system of concurrent jurisdictions below the thresholds, what I call a non-zero-sum game. Is there something good about this transformation? I suggest potentially yes. So cases that could be cross-border cases could be ad hoc looked at and central by the Commission. So we could have centralization of enforcement at the EU level when it's needed. Of course, this would need reliance on member states. The member states voluntarily need to agree to send cases to the Commission. The good part is that member states could be used as decentralized monitors. Sometimes they know more about which are those cases or people complain to them. But it's interesting to see from an institutional and political science, perhaps, perspective, how the Commission sees its role in EU merger control in general. And I'm suggesting in the paper that from an agent or a coordinator of cases, he sees itself now as a trustee of effective merger enforcement at the EU level that is more similar to its role in the antitrust realm or the realm of the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. If it was only merger control, perhaps the Commission would have some potential of this ad hoc centralization to work. The problem is that now we have alternative enforcement tools, such as Article 102 following the Tarakas judgment, and national enforcement that we see it's expanding. So it's not a given that in every case that the Commission wants a case, to be prosecuted at the EU level, the member states will agree and will not choose to enforce at national level. So essentially, the takeaway from here is that I'm suggesting it's not clear that we have beneficial centralization or coordination of the cases that need to be looked at the European level and deserve one-stop shop scrutiny when they need to, at least based on the current guidelines we have. So to sum up, I'm suggesting that Article 22 is not an effective solution, at least, to the deterrence and the externality problems I identify for the threshold-based system we had in Europe. And I also see other side effects, institutional side effects that this solution introduces. For example, we don't have a safe harbor anymore, but okay, perhaps that's not so important. We see that small transactions involving startups perhaps have a disproportionate burden on them, who perhaps need to notify the transaction in more member states. They're uncertain if jurisdiction will be with what authority, rather than large transactions that they know they only have to do one filing with the commission, and if they don't, that's it. Also, this change, the introduction and the expansion of Article 22, essentially changed the nature of EU merger control from a system that is based on ex-ante mandatory notification to more of a voluntary exposed system, okay? And importantly, without institutional constraints. So I explain also in the paper that we have limited judicial review, and third parties do not really participate in this process. Now, in the next part of the paper, I try to see what should we do, how should we think about the problem in order to think about solutions. And I'm suggesting that the fixed system of competence allocation we had in the EU based on thresholds was more of a preemptive federalism system. In the US, we have another system of dynamic federalism, and perhaps this problem of killer acquisitions forces us to move towards that model. One can understand the European solution found in Article 22 as a path-dependent solution. It's the best thing they found from what they had, considering that they thought it's risky to go ahead and amend the European merger regulation, because that would necessitate renegotiation with member states, and nobody knew what will come out of it. However, I suggest in the paper that it's a little bit ironic, because if we assume that through Article 22 ad hoc centralization can happen in good cases, the Commission cannot avoid member states. Since the referral mechanisms are voluntary, it depends on their pure will, basically, whether they will cooperate or not, okay? Then I suggest that perhaps we should combine elements of both, preemptive or dynamic, federalism to move towards a more adequate regime to tackle this problem. And in terms of solutions, I try to place the institutional solutions that I discuss along a continuum. One can think of them as more of decentralized or centralized options. And I take certain law and economics criteria in order to evaluate how well those different options are doing. So one of the criteria is how well they internalize externalities, so cross-border cases, how well are they doing in terms of transaction cost savings, one-stop shop review, for example, or economies of scale, or minimizing information costs and uncertainty, and then how well are they doing in terms of deterrence effects? How well are they doing in decreasing incentive costs, okay, regarding business behavior? So I suggest 4 alternatives. One would be ex-ante centralization, so reforming the thresholds that we have and expanding them, either lowering turnover thresholds or introducing new thresholds to expand EU competence. And perhaps we would capture more deals, but we're not sure we would capture the right deals. So it would be an inefficient and ineffective way, I'm suggesting. The second solution would be exposed centralization. Basically, this would mean a reform of case referrals in Article 22 to make them more principles, to have at least some certainty when this mechanism will be triggered and based on what conditions and so on. This would be better to what we have, but again, I don't think it will go all the way. The third solution would be full flexibilization and decentralization. Essentially here, I'm mirroring the US solution when we have full concurrent jurisdiction over mergers at the federal and state level. But importantly, EU liability would not depend on national competence, as we now have in the EU, okay? And this again could have pros and cons. It would give more flexibility, perhaps more deterrence, but perhaps we would even have over-deterrence. So different considerations here. I think the more complete solution, but also a little bit more challenging, both, in terms of practical aspects, but perhaps also politically, is the fourth one. And that would mean moving towards greater decentralization and ad hoc centralization when it's needed, together with a system of stronger centralized coordination based on some governance mechanism. And this essentially would mean reviewing the case referral system, but also the 2/3 rule, essentially cases that we think that should be predominantly looked at the national level. So we should perhaps encourage decentralization rather than the other way around. And only looking at ad hoc centralizing again through Article 22 cases that really deserve scrutiny at the EU level. In order to safeguard the legitimacy and the proper working of the system, I suggest some system of network governance similar to the ACN, the European Competition Network, that can coordinate these efforts. And to conclude, what is the takeaway from the paper? I suggest that since the introduction of the EUMR for the last 35 years, institutionally, nothing really happened in the system of EU merger control. So, meaning the thresholds were so resistant to change for a reason. They were part of the political bargain, as I explained, between the EU and the Commission, and that was one of the conditions for the EUMR to arise in the first place. So they were so resistant to change because they introduced a very clear-cut and certain system that everybody seemed to be happy enough with, so to say. Now, with this debate about killer acquisitions, the dynamics have changed and the discussion has changed, and we see that there is more demand for dynamism, or in other words, flexibility to be added to the European system of merger control that we have. The problem is that the way the Commission tried to do it through Article 22, which is a discretionary mechanism, introduced a lot of unpredictability and perhaps also politics in EU merger control. So this unpredictable and discretionary mechanism has an effect on business incentives, so what deals are proposed, and also authorities' strategies. So which cases they decide to send upwards or keep at home and enforce them at home. And we see that although the court in Illumina Grail narrowed the jurisdiction of the Commission based on Article 22 only for cases where member states have national competence, now we see that the latest expansion of calling powers at national level gives a second bite at the apple, if you wish, through Article 22. However, I'm suggesting that the game has changed already. There is kind of concurrent competences below the EUMR thresholds based on Article 22. Right now, as I explained earlier, it's not a given that we will have ad hoc centralization when it's needed based on Article 22. So now an uncoordinated Article 22 solution is not so effective. We need to address that. I suggested there are mechanisms to do that earlier. And lastly, there is still an ongoing debate of what we should do about it. I tried to underscore, because of the deficiencies of this solution, that what we have is not enough, and we need to move towards a more efficient system of European merger control, including referral mechanisms. And really, our eyes should be on EU competitiveness and innovation, that the Commission uses buzzwords about everything these days. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yep.
I think the most important message here, and also this complex system, is the deterrence. This effect on business incentives and the national competition authority strategy is possibly deterring a lot of what are the potential killer acquisitions. So it pays back through that door, but usually is the one that is hard to account for and calculate what is the effect on deterrence. But I do believe that the unpredictability, actually, if the companies internalize that and understand what it means, it might also mean that you think twice before going to an acquisition which is killer. If you're sure it's not a killer acquisition, then you're possibly more likely to do. I'm still always, myself questioning the concept of killer acquisition. Think about the film Google and Waze was a killer acquisition. For one of the beginning, we consider that to be a killer acquisition. But then I look at the two products now. You can use Waze, you can go Google Maps, you have a choice. Of course, you don't know where your data are going to, they have to go to the same company, but they still maintain, if you want, the brand is there, Waze remain. So it's an acquisition that, has absorbed resources. You can see lots of complementarity going into that, but we could have a killer acquisition because it has affected competition. Potential partner always could become, a competitor on the market. So some of them, when you look into the nitty-gritty, what we consider still to be killer acquisition, retrospectively exposed, it's
not clear.
it's not clear even exposed where they are. But I understand that there exist one that are the bad one. We're trying to understand what they are and what they produce in terms of outcome. But you're basically spending lots of resources on a 2% acquisition that are potentially anti-competitive. They allow the big one to go through, and then because of my point is more on the deterrence, which is a key important aspect.
For me, this is the whole reason why I wrote the paper, because before we had complete under deterrence, in my view, a lot of the European systems were based on the EU model, so they had also filing thresholds. One example is France, that they're also trying to revise the regime now. So why I wrote it, I completely agree that it's challenging, both ex ante and ex post, to look at those deals. So the best chance we have as competition authorities, rather than second guessing, is to design as close possible to an optimal regime, and then let companies decide on their own which cases to pursue or not, okay, and with when to merge or not to merge. I think from my point of view, that is why I wanted to throw a non-economics lens on this problem, because if we want to micromanage, I don't think we will do so well. Maybe some cases will capture, but maybe we'll be hit and miss, and many more cases we will, stop that we shouldn't. I don't know.
But that's the problem. Now, if you start looking at how many do you capture in the new system, you capture so few. You think the system is not effective because it's not able to capture them. Usually, we don't capture that because there is deterrence, and therefore it's.
No, I echo your thoughts. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to this point you were making about the politics of the way the system was set up, and ask. When the Commission most recently adapted Article 22 in the way that you say was avoiding the old deal, escaping the old deal, did member states have an ability to object in some way procedurally to that process that the European Commission was implementing, or not? So
you mean the recent change? The recent change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there procedurally a way for them to object? No.
There were informal discussions. So to be fair, I think member states were kind of happy with this situation because they didn't want to deal with this problem on their own at national level, except perhaps some that felt more strongly about this, such as Germany. So most national authorities felt, it's a problem beyond their capacity to deal with. So they were happy for the Commission to assert more jurisdiction. But the way it was done, it was not right, I think. And if they really wanted, why then they didn't go ahead and amend the EUMR the proper way?
Yeah, that's the big question.
That
right?
is a big
Because
question. If
they
they were
must have
so
thought they
certain
wouldn't
that
succeed.
everybody would agree, why they didn't do that?
Exactly.
Because then they will open Pandora's box, much more will be under negotiation, and they didn't want to do that. It will not be just their referral mechanism, in my view.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
it's
Thank you.
complicated. Yes.
So hi, so it's related. My question is related to this one. So I found it really interesting how you basically remark how the merger regulation was the result of a political bargain, and basically with the referral mechanism of the guidelines in 21, the Commission reintroduces the political dimension that was lost before, right?
Yeah.
And so my question, if I remember correctly, in Illumina Grail, France was one of the member states that answered to the referral, and I guess I can see how it fits into their wider industrial policy. They're always very strong, finding a European champion. And in the other, you mentioned there are 10 other cases.
So exactly. So EU innovation and competitiveness could be used as an excuse to bring any case, basically, you know, based on the, and it's ironic because both Illumina Crane and Towercast, France is behind both of them actually. So there was a referral to the ECJ on the Towercast case, you know, there was a competitor who complained and they said, the commission, the French competition authority decided that they cannot use Article 102 against mergers following the EU position, but for the EU is a little bit different because we have this implementing regulation that was disapplied. However, at member states, it's not clear, like in theory they could use it, but there was an implicit kind of deal that we don't use antitrust rules anymore. So then someone complained because the French authority decided not to use Article 22. They said we can only use national merger control, and national merger control doesn't apply here. So that's all we can do. And then there was a complainant, and that complainant went through the French courts, and then the case was referred from the French courts to the European courts, and they decide on Towercast. That's how suddenly we had the Towercast. And I don't think the timing is a complete coincidence because, you know, we see developing markets essentially. And on your other question about Illumina Grail, it's the same. Like France and other member states who did not have power, for example, Germany or Austria introduced transaction value thresholds. It's not that again they would capture all deals, but perhaps they would capture more or some important ones, you know, that were flagging out there. And then some other member states perhaps felt that they haven't caught that train. You know, knowing the limitations of their own system, they wanted to make sure that we're all on this train together. Kind of, this is my naive understanding at least. And because I had studied a lot these aspects of for me it was perhaps more obvious to see what was happening when this story about killer acquisitions came out. I don't know if I answered your question, but if I haven't, you can ask again.
Yeah, I guess it's just like there is an additional layer of uncertainty that comes from like the politics within the member states. So some member states will want to refer more cases and some others not, right?
That's exactly what I'm saying. So when the EUMR was introduced, in the background there were member states who could block mergers on public interest grounds. So there was a huge debate about whether to have an EU merger regulation that was based purely on competition criteria. So that thing, the Commission succeeded to negotiate, and you know it passed, and that is history. But then we see back how that discussion comes back indirectly in this context, and how politics essentially through the back door. And this basically the deterrence point and this point, I tried to combine them somehow in this paper. Yeah, it's interesting.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's been great to have you.